Passing objects to methods. So, this is kind of a contrived example. This is not normal like way you would do what I'm doing. It's just for the sake of example. I want to check the book and see if they had like a reasonable example, and it was fairly similar to one I have here. So I'm just going to go with this one. You just need to know what this is about, how the syntax of passing an object to a method looks like. So what we're talking about is we have these points. They're a new data type, right? And you know that you can pass, for example, these two integer arguments, you can pass them to the constructor. So how do you pass a point if you ever need to? You just pass it. Basically, I don't want to, but I got an example cooked up for you, but it's really, it's kind of like, I think it's intuitive, but I just want to make it explicit that, how you do it. So, I've created this method within point demo. Now keep in mind, I haven't really gone over static yet, but just briefly, what static means is that it's a method. Well, in this case, I'm using it on a method. You can use it on different things, but when you use it on a method, what you're saying is that you don't have to create an object of that type in order to use that method. So point demo is really just kind of a class to encapsulate main, so you can do our programming. Keep in mind when you start your program, you don't have any objects instantiated. How could you? Because it hasn't started yet. So to have like a bootstrapping mechanism here, you have this idea of static, which means that there's one location in memory where the code for this is saved. Whereas when you have an object, like a point, I can make a whole ton of points, and each one will look very similar to each other. They might have different specific values inside of them, different coordinates. But it's a blueprint, right? I can make a whole bunch of different ones of those. If a class or a method or a variable or whatever is static, you can only have one copy of it in memory. So something similar to that, a static class would be the math class. You notice you don't create instances of math classes. You don't create objects. You don't say math m gets new math. You just use math things, right? Let me just show you what I mean by that. Math dot, right? You don't say math m gets new math. You just start using it. That's what it means for it to be static. So that's why these methods that you had originally main, when you had to first learn about methods, were static. It's because you weren't making them, you weren't creating methods or using methods that were, you've been using methods that are part of objects the whole time, whether it's static or not. But in this case, they're not static because when you instantiate this, every object has its own separate copy of each of these methods. So that's why they're not static. So, okay, that was not brief. But anyway, so what I'm doing here is I'm creating, just for the sake of example, this is not how you would normally want to deal with a point. This is not object-oriented. This is not an object-oriented way of doing this. But you might, later on, you'll send a variable that contains a reference to an object to maybe a different class's object. Something like that's coming up very soon, actually. So let me just show you how this works. I have this method, print point, and it takes a point as an argument. In other words, it's got a point parameter. So it just looks like what you would think. In order to use it, what you would do is you would say print point. Because it's static, it's not, there's nothing dot print point, right? It's just print point. And then you would send the point argument to it. So the point argument that I have available to me right now is point P1. So, and this is just to show you, again, the better way to do this is really P1 dot print point, and there's an even better way than that you'll learn later on. But for now, this is just showing how you would send an object to a method. And what it really does, keep in mind, what does P1 store? What is its value? Its value is the memory address of this object that we create here. There's a whole big set of memory that's devoted to describing how a point works. In other words, it contains all this logic. The first byte of that memory address is stored, well, not the first byte, but the address of the first the beginning of that memory sequence is stored right here. So this is going to be some long hexadecimal digit, or series of zeros and ones, really. We're sending that pattern through P1 to here so it knows which memory address that you're talking about, which particular object, because you could have more than one, right? So just a further example, point P2 is a new point. Let's just make it a new point. What does that do? For the previous lesson, right? It's 0, 0. So we can call print point on it too. P2. So when I run this, I should get, what is it, 4, 5, and then 0, 0. That's pretty much it. Like it's just when you want to create a method that takes an object as a parameter, you just use the name of the class and the variable name you want to call it within that program. Notice this is P here. Sometimes P means P1, sometimes it means P2, depending on which argument we send to this method.